We're back with our expert, Craig Smith, discussing gun control and the Second Amendment. We started the first segment with the wording of the Second Amendment. Craig, as we both know, what a constitution means is a function of what the Supreme Court says it means. What has the Supreme Court opined on the Second Amendment?
Well, I think, as I said earlier in the first segment, I think they misinterpret it by a 5-4 margin. So it only takes one judge to change. They have said that the First Amendment means that everybody... Second Amendment allows everybody to have a gun. You can require registration, but you can't keep people from having guns.
So possession is constitutionally protected.
That's correct.
According to the Supreme Court.
According to 5 members of the Supreme Court.
In 2010, in the Chicago case.
That's correct. What happened were, there were a number of conflicting decisions that came up to the Supreme Court. The Louisiana district said you can't restrict ownership. DC said you can restrict ownership. The Ninth Circuit Court, which we're in California, said you can restrict ownership. So all of that went up to the Supreme Court. Now the California argument...
And that's a classic case of where Supreme Court grants cert and takes a case, conflict among the districts.
That's correct. And the California decision, the Ninth Circuit decision written by Judge Reinhardt, was the most interesting because he took the approach of the normally conservative justices. He said, let's look at the original intent when the Second Amendment was passed and interpret it in terms of the original intent. And since it said that the states had the right to issue the guns in order to form a militia, that was all that was meant by the Second Amendment. Therefore, you can restrict individuals.
So a liberal court, the Ninth Circuit, used conservative original intent to come up with their decision, and the Supreme Court, which is a conservative court, didn't buy it.
The 5 who normally rely on original intent, including Scalia and Rehnquist and so forth, went the other way and said, no, we're just going to read the amendment by word and interpret it that way. So there was a lot of hypocrisy on the Supreme Court in this. If we're going to win, now, as you know, if you can't get something done in the legislature, or if the legislature passes what you want and then it gets overturned, you can go to the courts. And so our hope, I think, is that in light of these tragedies, the Supreme Court at some point will revisit this case, that the Supreme Court will then say, some conservative will stand up and be a hero and say, you know, I was wrong, original intent, I'm switching to the other side, like Judge Kennedy.
Or there may be a new justice on the court.
Or there may be a new justice on the Supreme Court. So,
and with President Obama, he or she would be of the more liberal persuasion.
Right, and could flip it. The amazing thing here is it only takes one justice changing. This is a 5-4 decision. It's hardly presidential.
Well, you just have the feeling that the country has shifted. We have reset the thinking on gun control. And although courts theoretically are purists and they just look at the law, someone once said the Supreme Court reads election returns.
Yes. They certainly did in 1936, as you may recall, before our time.
Yes.
But when Roosevelt overwhelmingly was reelected, suddenly the court started approving his
New Deal was okay.
The New Deal was okay.
Yeah. Well, we're going to continue this conversation, but first we have to pause again for these messages. Craig, let's shift for a moment from gun control to politics and presidential elections. You were last on the show that we taped on September 7th, airing late September, early October. And at that time, you predicted a Romney presidential victory. It didn't work out that way. What were the reasons that it went, in your judgment, the opposite way?
Well, at the time I said, I hate to make predictions because you never know what's going to pop up and change things. It was a conditional recommendation. One of the reasons I made that prediction was because the enthusiasm for Barack Obama had fallen so much. I was right about that. He ran 6 million votes behind what he got in 2008. No president has run that far behind his previous record and gotten reelected.
And was the turnout nationally the same or greater?
It was lower. It was lower.
For everyone, it was lower.
Yes, yes. But the big surprise was Romney ran 300,000 votes behind what McCain got.
Wow.
So he ran even worse than McCain.
Wow.
Here's another statistic you'll love. John McCain got a higher percentage of the Mormon vote than Mitt Romney did. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than that.
And why? What was going on?
I think people perceived that Romney had shifted from being a moderate Republican governor of Massachusetts to becoming very conservative in order to get the Republican nomination, and then went back toward the middle to try and win the election.
So the hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy issue hurt him. Then when they saw the tape of that fundraising speech where he said that 47% of the American people were on the dole and wouldn't vote for him, it showed his true colors, and people thought, okay, that's the guy. I see him now when he's off the record, and there was no way to unexplain that.
So that was very damaging.
That was devastating. The first debate put him back into the race.
Yeah,
he did very well there.
And you had predicted that he would do well in the debates,
I did.
and you were right on the money.
I got something right.
Well, this points to perhaps a need of the Republican Party to rethink itself, to reshape itself. You pointed out before we went on air that the Democrats did that before President Clinton was elected by forming that Southern group.
Yeah, it was the Southern Leadership Conference. It was formed when George Bush Sr. was president. The Democrats said we need to recalibrate. They were led.
They were too far to the left.
They were too far to the left. They were perceived as too far to the left. Bill Clinton was one of the leaders in that. Al Gore was another. They did all those things. They ran, they won. I think the Republicans need to do this. They used to have a conference in Maryland called the Tidewater Conference. I helped run it. I was a parliamentarian at it, where we brought in resolutions. We recalibrated what it meant to be a Republican and what we could do to win. And I think they need to bring something like that back.
The problem, to cut to the chase, in the view of many with the Republican Party, is that it's too dominated by the right wing.
Yeah, and I think the social right wing.
Social right wing.
The Republican Party is fine as a fiscal conservative party, as a party that encourages business and produces jobs. But when you get into social issues, and you have Senate candidates saying things about the abortion issue that are quite crazy, it paints the party with a brush that's just too far to the right.
So to become a viable presidential party in the future, they need to rethink what they stand for.
Yeah, I mean, you can be opposed to a woman's right to have an abortion, but be compassionate about it and be logical about it. Ronald Reagan was, George Bush Sr. was. It's the crazy talk that I think gets them in trouble.
And we also need continued reforms in the political process. The Democrats aren't pure on this either. No. Money is having an inordinate influence. We did get redistricting reform, at least here in California, which was great. But there still are some needed reforms to bring the political system in line. And I know there's this one group, No Labels, and several of the candidates on our show referenced that in the course of the debates. People are sick of the ideologues. They want real solutions for real problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other problem is that you have so many cable channels available to people that voters are becoming calcified in their positions. They can go to someone somewhere on a cable channel that will say, you're right.
Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's no good either.
No.
Okay, we'll be back with the rest of our show after these messages. Continuing our conversation with constitutional expert Craig Smith, director of the Center for First Amendment Studies. Craig, there are a lot of things that in politics that don't seem to comport with what many of us would view as ethical principles. Bills that are gut and amend, where you have a bill on subject X, and at the last minute you take everything out and put in stuff on subject Y and get it passed with no one reading it. What's the justification for that?
Well, there isn't, and I think that the Senate needs to clean up its act. I was taught parliamentary Senate procedure, and I tell you, it's more arcane than anything you could ever imagine. That's why they don't like using it. That's why they try to do everything by unanimous consent. But you can You can filibuster by amending and amending and amending and amending on a limited number of times. They're going to try and reform that at the beginning of this session. You can, the old way of doing a filibuster, you know, anybody who watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was you had to stand and speak. Physically stand and speak. Yeah. And then they ended that and said you could just put a hold on something. It's terribly anti-democratic to require 60 votes to pass something.
It's changing the Constitution de facto.
Absolutely.
And it's caused all kinds of problems in getting work done.
Yes.
And of course, the granddaddy of them all, campaign spending and the Citizens United case. Now, some of us feel that instant and full disclosure is the best we can possibly hope for, that you immediately know who stopped these shadow parties, Citizens for Good Government, and find out who's really giving the money and instantaneously disclose to everybody that so-and-so gave $5 million. And that's because campaign limitations are always trying to stop what some view as the impossible. Politicians who need money and donors who want to give it and get whatever benefits they get from giving, and you just can't stop that.
Yeah, I think full disclosure is one really good remedy. As long as I know who's giving you your money and I can make a commercial about who's giving you your money, it levels the playing field. Yeah. We can't stop the spigots because of Citizens United, the 2012 decision by the Supreme Court, which allows unions and corporations to spend money to their heart's content.
And it's had an enormously negative influence, I think, on the election cycle.
Well, I don't know if it's negative or positive. It's certainly overwhelming, and certainly down ticket races, assemblyman, state senator, where we don't pay as much attention as we should. We get influenced by the ads there, and they're overwhelming the voters in terms of opinions.
Yeah. Well, Craig, again, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see you, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too.
Okay, please join us next week for the next edition of our show. Good night, everyone.
Straight Talk has been brought to you by Southern California Edison, the Press Telegram, and remember, Straight Talk is viewable worldwide 24/7 at straighttalktv.com.